Thank you. Thank you all of you for being here this evening. We are ready to start. So welcome to the world of monetary valuation. I think we're jumping now from the biophysical world to the monetary valuation world. We have here today 4 guests that they are going to talk about monetary valuation in the context of SEEA and about exchange values. I'm happy to introduce you Gabriela Schuffele. Sorry, Gabriela, I don't know if I did pronounce that well.
Thank you.
She works at the Commonwealth Scientific and Industrial Research Centre in Australia. We're really happy to have her online today. After that, I'm sorry to announce that Pablo Campos from CSIC, he couldn't make it today because he got tested positive for COVID on Sunday. But instead of him, Bruno Mesa, one of our collaborators at CSIC, he's going to present his presentation. After that, Alejandro Caparrós, also online from the University of Durham. We'll talk about simulated exchange values. And to close the session, Adrien Comte from CIRED. We'll talk about monetary ecosystem accounts in France. So welcome all of you. And we start with Gabriela. Hello, Gabriela. You can start.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everybody. First of all, I want to thank the organizers to give me the opportunity to present the work of my colleague Jean Pascal and myself on accounting on free access recreation. As we all know, the ecosystem accounting framework has expanded the production boundary of the system of national accounts beyond those goods and services that are bought and sold in markets. So that has created the need for accounting for so-called non-market benefits, both in physical and monetary terms. Now, the fact that the economic accounting framework is based on the exchange value concept has posed some challenges for monetary valuation. The concept of exchange value implies, sure, I can't move on. Slides. Sorry, I have a problem with my slides. Into my slides, maybe I go presentation mode. I apologize. Can you see my slides?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, okay. I just have to do it not in presentation mode. That doesn't seem to work for some reason. So the concept of exchange value basically implies that ecosystem assets and the services they generate are valued at prices exchange in markets, or at prices if market would exist. So the second part of that definition is really important when we move into the world of non-market benefits, since it provides a justification or an opportunity to simulate such market prices, which of course represent, in essence, exchange prices, which are needed to derive exchange values. So the very nature of these non-market benefits, of course, means that we don't have markets at our disposal that conveniently generate prices and quantities, which then can be used to derive these exchange values. So we need to find different ways to generate such data. And one way to generate such data is to use so-called non-market valuation methods. And there's a whole raft of those. And they're quite established. They've been developed over the last few decades. However, even though they are well established, they've been developed to estimate delta values for non-market benefits instead of exchange values. So that means that these methods and their use need to be adjusted to comply with accounting principles as set out in the ecosystem accounting framework. So now, what I wanna talk to you about today is basically to show how to use one of these non-market valuations methods, the travel cost method, to derive such exchange values for free access recreation. As some of you might know, the travel cost method is probably the most commonly used non-market valuation method to derive welfare values for recreational fishing. So let's have a look at situation of free access recreation. So on this diagram, we see on the x-axis, we have the number of trips, and on the y-axis, we have the value per trip. And what we can see here is a demand curve, the demand for recreational trips to destination. And we also have information on trip cost. So trip costs would include things like getting to the site, so travel cost in essence, but also staying at the site, such as accommodation, or also basically if you need some equipment, such as a fishing rod. So that's all expenditure to be able to basically enjoy that recreational activity. So in this presentation, I call that trip cost. And as you can see, if we know how many trips people on average do, then we can calculate the trip expenditure, which is the trip cost multiplied by the trip number. So now we can also see that we'll find the maximum number of trips people are willing to pay is where demand equals supply, so meaning the marginal benefit approaches zero. So in other words, if the cost of going there is more than my enjoyment, I won't go. So this is this point, free access quantity. Now this graph shows that there are no access fees basically present. So people don't have to pay to access your recreational area. So that means all they have to pay for is really the trip cost. So the trip cost, of course, is all intermediate consumption, which is already captured within the system of national accounts. What's not captured, however, is the exchange value of the recreational opportunities provided by the ecosystem itself. It's at the moment valued at zero. So what can be done? The first one way of basically estimating an exchange price that then allows us to derive an exchange value is to use the so-called simulated exchange value method. To my best knowledge, that method was first suggested by Alessandro Caparros in a paper published in 2017. And basically what it does is it says, okay, you need a demand function. You can estimate that using any non-market valuation method, for example, the travel cost method, but you could also use contingent valuation and other methods. And then you need to make some assumption about the market type. So one suggestion that might be justifiable, depending on the situation, is to assume you have monopolistic competition. So that might be justified because recreational areas are often limited in numbers. New market entry is restricted, and you could probably argue that they have unique features that cannot be duplicated anywhere else very easily. So there might be some justification for that assumption. Once you can make that assumption, you then can basically find the profit maximizing price and quantity by equalizing the marginal revenue, which can be derived from the demand curve, equalize the marginal revenue with the marginal cost. And from there, you can then derive the exchange price. I go in more detail in a second. So basically what the method does is to carve out this yellow section here, to carve out a part of the consumer surplus and basically convert it into an exchange value. Now in this diagram, it's basically suggested that the benefits are generated jointly by the ecosystem, which provides recreational opportunities such as fish biomass or landscape beauty, but there's also a component of the household inputs. So households also which are part of the production process of these benefits. So it's produced jointly, basically. But in most cases, we have a third player here, which in the ecosystem accounting framework is called the government. It might be any regulatory body or authority, or in fact government, who does things like management of an area, maintenance of infrastructure, or governance. So it's a third party in the production process, and I call these costs that come with all these activities enabling costs in my presentation. Okay, now let's have a closer look on how we can simulate these exchange prices and exchange values using the travel cost method. So in this diagram, basically what you see is sort of an illustration of a marginal benefit function here that's been generated based on travel cost data using a log linear function, which is very popular in the world of non-market valuation because it has a lot of nice features, what we want to use it for. And then from the marginal benefit curve, you can easily derive the marginal revenue curve. So now what do you see in that diagram? Let's first walk through if there wasn't an access fee. So the current situation, free access. People don't have to pay to go, for example, fishing to a certain area. So we can see that we have a marginal cost curve here. So the marginal cost per trip is D, distance from A to D. And we can see that the maximum number of trips people would do is at point C. So this area DF CA is the expenditure, total expenditure. People are willing to make. And then we can also see that all the rest under the demand curve above the supply curve, so J, DF, all these triangle here, it's all consumer surplus. So now the non-market valuation people really like using the log linear function because it has this really nice property that in the ratio of -1 over the cost coefficient of the function gives you the average willingness to pay per trip. And then this number is usually multiplied by the average number of trips per person, and that is multiplied by the total number of fishers. So it's a very convenient way of using that function to derive what we call consumer surplus. But as we all know, in ecosystem accounting, we don't want consumer surplus, we want exchange value. How are we going to go about that? So as I said, we basically need to equalize marginal revenue. It's this curve here, where it cuts the marginal cost, that's here. So point E is where they cut. So we have the quantity demanded under the new access regime with access fees, and we the number demand, we get the exchange price. And we multiply exchange price by exchange quantity, and we get HHED, which is the exchange value net of trip cost. So that's the exchange value of the contribution of the ecosystem itself. Now, what we show in our paper is that if you use a log linear function, and if you assume that the enabling costs are fixed, which we have in this case, the cost function here is sort of a constant amount, a fixed amount, and a variable amount. Of course, if you take the first derivative, the variable amount is 0, then the costs drop out, and the enabling costs are basically 0. This is shown in this diagram. So that means that if we assume fixed enabling cost, a log linear function, and monopolistic competition, it turns out that the average willingness to pay per trip is equal to the exchange price. Even so they're equal, they have different meaning, of course, and we're multiplying it by different amount of quantities, but it quite simplifies things quite a lot. So now the situation changes slightly if we assume that not all enabling costs are fixed. So remember, enabling costs were the cost of management, maintenance, etc., done by governments, for example. So if we have fixed and enabling costs, then a situation changes because now the enabling costs is marked with this line here at W. So we're increasing the marginal cost. That, of course, pushes the profit maximizing price up to Y and reduces the profit maximizing quantity to U. So we're changing the exchange value. So the change in marginal cost needs to be accounted for. So it's not as simple as it was before, but not much more complicated to derive. So now let's have a look how this looks if we actually apply all these concepts and equations to an actual case study. So we used fishing data that was analyzed through a log linear functions or a travel cost model previously, and we basically used that and transferred that into an accounting setting. And that's recreational fishing in Moreton Bay. It's on the east coast of Australia. So the ecosystem service is provision of recreational opportunities. We have no access fees. And we have a final product that's produced by ecosystem, government, and households. Now, this is how our first table looks like. So we have 4 scenarios. The first is free access. The second one is all enabling costs are fixed. Scenario B, we have some fixed, some variable enabling costs. And scenario C, all enabling costs are variable. And you can see, of course, the average willingness to pay is the same across all scenarios, but that the simulated exchange price increases with increasing enabling costs, variable enabling costs. And of course, the quantity demanded of trips goes down. And then if we add that all up and use the total trip cost, including the access costs, and we basically declare this in the next table to be the value of final product. So it's the exchange value of the final product here in the first line. And then if we want to derive value added or net operating surplus, we of course have to deduct the costs. In our case, we have 2 lots of intermediate consumption. We have trip cost and enabling cost. We have some fixed capital costs, and we have some labor costs. So if we net that all out, we're ending up with the net operating surplus. And then the last step, which I think is really important, but it's really hard to do, and we didn't have enough data to do it, is then to separate out that value between the surplus generated by the ecosystem service itself, like the ecosystem contribution, and the manufactured services, for example, parking lots or chatty or fishing. So now this can be disentangled if you had any data on rate of returns of manufactured capital, or if you had relative preferences across the 2 types of services. We didn't have that, but I think it's really important to do because there's some substitution effects potentially going on. So if your ecosystem services are run down, so the environment gets bad, but you compensate by better manufacture infrastructure, it could cover up basically a depletion or a decrease in the value because it just substituted across the 2 different types of services. So yeah, so in conclusion, the final output of many free access nature-based recreational experiences produced jointly. The trip costs are indeed intermediate consumption that's already included in the system of national accounts. So the ecosystem contribution is, if you only use that number, basically 0. And then we can use the simulated exchange value method to internalize part of the consumer surplus and declare it an exchange value of the ecosystem contribution. And as it turns out, the simulated exchange price net of travel cost, making all these assumptions I did, is equal to the average willingness to pay, which you usually estimate in this type of travel cost models. But of course, they have a different meaning and are used differently to build accounts versus to estimate the consumer surplus. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Gabriela. We only have time for one quick question because we are late.
There's a question on the chat from Jana.
There's some hands raised.
Yes.
On the chat, you have a question.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Yes, please ask. I'm unable to put my camera on because I have trouble getting to the big screen again.
Sure, Gabriela. No worries, no worries. Thank you so much for the nice presentation. I would like to ask, because the simulated exchange value method, it seems that it can solve a lot of issues when it comes to how to translate welfare values into exchange value. So this is quite promising to see. But my question, and this is what I don't understand cases, in many cases when I read papers and I read applications of the SEV method, is in cases where you want to apply the method in services where you have no clue of the cost, or maybe you don't even have any cost. I mean, we were trying to see how the SEV method could be applied for valuing habitat and species maintenance service, which is, of course, a service where you have mostly non-use values. And we use the choice experiment method to evaluate the method. And then we try to see how the SEV approach could give us an idea on how to translate these welfare values into exchange values, but it didn't work. So I would like to hear from you in those cases. I mean, where the safe approach could be applicable. Is it for certain services, such as recreation, for the reasons you have just presented, or it can be even extended, or maybe it's an area that has to be further explored? So all this stuff.
Well, thank you for asking the question. It's actually quite interesting because I'm also part of a paper we're just writing up where we've used the choice experiment to estimate exchange values for species protection in one of the regions in Australia. And as it turns out, there's quite actually the non-use valuation for exchange rate is actually more complicated than for use benefits, even though they're non-market, because you really run into trouble there. One thing is that you're basically always in the choice experiment, as you know, you have a policy change. You suggest a hypothetical policy change. Now in accounting, there's no policy change. So you're basically suggesting a policy change, and then you pretend, well, there is no policy change in the accounting framework. So that's an issue, and we need to find a solution to that. So one way forward could be to say, well, these numbers are contingent of certain policy scenarios you predict in the future. And that would be one solution in that respect. Another really big issue, and that's what we're trying to really filter out in our paper, is that framing really matters. It matters whether it's a one-off payment, an annual payment. Is it if you have changing baselines when you look into the future? There's a lot of issues with framing, which this paper we are writing up right now actually challenges you. But we think we have found a way to get in the direction of doing that. So will be published hopefully soon. But if you want to have a chat of this bigger plenum here, I'm happy to get in contact and we can talk about it. I would be interested to see what you guys did. Yeah,
definitely. Thanks a lot.
Okay, so we have to move forward, please. I think Bruno Mesa from CSIC is presenting.
First of all, thank you everybody for coming to this event. I am Bruno Mesa and work with Pablo Campos, José Luis Oviedo, Alejandro Caparrós, and Alejandra Álvarez. And I will try to do my best with Pablo's presentation. Well, the presentation is monetary SEEA application in Andalusia forest. The first is to take account that the forests of Andalusia region extend over an area of 40,000 square kilometers. In this map, you can see the distribution of different forest formations. What should be the objective of the monetary SEEA? The objective must be to measure the total income and its fractional distribution amongst labor income, manufacturer capital income, and ecosystem environmental income of the individual products valued in ecosystem accounting area. In the Andalusia forest, the total income factorial distribution that we have estimate is the one you can see in this equation with the components. What is the net operating surplus? Net operating surplus is the operating return of a product immobilized total capital, and the components are the manufactured net operating surplus accruing from competitive or residual operating return of manufactured immobilized capital, plus environmental net operating surplus accruing from competitive or residual operating return on the environmental assets of a biophysical natural product. The value of the net operating surplus under the SEEA in the Andalusian forest that we have estimate are the one that you can see in the equation below. And then what is the environmental net operating surplus? The environmental net operating surplus components are the depletion from the withdrawals used of environmental work in progress inventory at opening of the period, plus ordinary environmental net operating margin as a result on environmental fixed asset. The environmental net operating surplus under the SEEA in the Andalusian forest is the result below with the two components. The SEEA presents a synonymy problem where several terms are just the equal. For example, environmental net operating surplus is equal to ecosystem services and resource services. And in the other side, depletion is equal to environmental work in progress used. What is changed in environmental assets? In the SEEA, the change of environmental asset components are the enhancement or a degradation at the closing of the accounting period in the biophysical productivity or service quality of an individual product environmental asset, plus the timing effect of discount over the course of accounting period. The change of environmental asset under the SEEA in the Andalusian forest is closing less opening environmental assets, as you can see in this equation, and the result is the same that the change of environmental asset estimate as the environmental asset revaluation less the depletion. This table, you can see the environmental asset balance sheet account under the SEEA applied in Andalusia forest areas. Is estimate for the farmer and the activities of the farmer, the ecosystem trustee and the activities of the ecosystem trustee, and the total of environmental assets. The principal environmental assets in the opening in this table and in the results we have obtained is that the amenity is the highest value, then the landscape, water, carbon, recreation, and grazing. What is the change of environmental asset adjusted environmental net operating surplus? This concept components are environmental net operating surplus plus change in environmental assets. This concept results shows for the under the SEEA for the Andalusian forest a result of 4,016 in the results we have researched. A possible problem of double counting of the change of environmental asset adjusted environmental net operating surplus is that the SEEA may incorporate ordinary environmental net operating margin that it's also incorporated in the environmental net operating surplus. The concept of change of environmental assets adjusted environmental net operating surplus double counting of the ordinary environmental net operating margin is avoided by the environmental income. And what is the environmental income? The environmental income is the maximum possible environmental net operating surplus contribution to a biophysical natural product total income without a decline. It is in its closing environmental asset in the accounting period. The income generation and the environmental assets balance sheets account under the SEEA record all the data required to estimate the environmental income. Uncovering the SEEA environmental income. The possible environmental income components are a change of environmental asset adjusted environmental net operating surplus less double counting of the carbon ordinary environmental net operating margin. The environmental income we have estimate under the SEEA in the Andalusian forest is the one you can see in this equation with the two components I have mentioned before. And this table is a compendium of the environmental income under the SEEA applied in Andalusia forest areas with the provision and services and the activities that is in this category, regulation services and his activities, and cultural service and his activities, and the environmental incomes. The values of the farmer and the ecosystem trustee in the total are similar, and the highest value corresponds with the cultural services, then the provisioning services, and finally the regulating services. Concluding remarks. It's assumed that change in land price are due to forest enhancement or degradation in quality of private amenity services. The rejection of environmental income in the SEEA on the grounds of the capital gain is not consistent with the system of national accounts might be not correct. The system of national account incorporates the manufactured capital gain in the inventory change in livestock, final output in the manufactured consumption of fixed capital valued at replacement price. Lessons learned in the SEEA applied in the Forest Andalusia. The SEEA recommend change environmental asset adjusted environmental net operating surplus matches the environmental income, except for the carbon product due to the double counting of the ordinary environmental net operating margin of carbon by the concept of change of environmental assets adjusted environmental net operating surplus. You can see the equation of this relation. And finally, but not least, monetary SEEA standardization challenge. The future standardization of the monetary SEEA should agree on the measurement of the environmental income consistently integrated with a total income accruing from an individual biophysical natural products valued in an ecosystem accounting area. And you can see here several photos of these as of Andalusia, of Holm Oaks, corn cokes, and you can see here Pablo in the desert of Almeria, also known as Desert of Tabernas. Thank you very much. And for conceptual questions, you can email Pablo. He has.
He has taken this huge responsibility of presenting Pablo's research, and I'm really grateful for that. We may have time for one question, and then we move forward for the next presentation. There's a hand raised. Gabriela?
Yeah, I would be super interested to know how you valued in monetary terms biodiversity.
So can you say that again?
I would be super interested to know how you valued in monetary terms biodiversity. What method did you use? How did you do it?
To answer that, biodiversity. I can answer that. Yeah. I'll answer to that, Gabriela, because I was part of the research team. And at some point, I'll answer to Joanna, because she asked about how to use choice experiments in and simulated change value. So we actually we designed it and applied a choice experiment as part of this project to estimate the demand function for protecting one additional species in the Andalusian forest. And based on that demand, we simulated the potential exchange value that could be internalized in the economy if a payment for biodiversity protection would be real in the forest. So it's the same concept we use for recreation, the one you have shown in your travel cost application, but using a choice experiment. After all, what we need here is a demand function, and based on that demand, we can estimate that area that you showed in your PowerPoint. which correspond to the simulated exchange value, which is basically how much money we could get if a potential market would be actually implemented. That's the whole idea of the. But you know, I think I'm overlapping with Alejandro's presentation, which is about this right now. So
I just wondering whether was your demand function flat, or was it actually diminishing marginal benefit? Like, do you have a downward sloping demand curve, given that you had just a very small margin, I guess you estimated in your choice experiment?
Sorry, I'm having trouble.
It's okay. I don't want to hold on everybody.
Okay, we'll move to Alejandro's presentation. He may clarify this concept. Alejandro, are you ready?
Yes, I'm ready. Thank you. And yes, the demand is just to finish the question, to answer the question. The demand was downward sloping. What we were trying to do, we were doing at the same time biodiversity and landscape amenities in the same choice experiment, and we are presenting with a scenario where both are declining and making payments for maintaining it, the current one. So that's because, as you said before, you're not changing this scenario. We were trying to present a scenario where both were declining, landscape amenities and biodiversity, and the payment was to maintain the current status, and that's why we could use it directly. The details you have is in the paper in Ecological Economics, Campos et al. 2019. It's a huge paper with a lot of things, but there you will find the details if you're interested. Thanks anyway for that.
Thank you.
So I'm gonna share my screen now. So hello again. I'm presenting now a paper on work on simulated exchange value that we have been doing in monetary ecosystem accounts in Spain. And here some of the co-authors have contributed different parts of the past or ongoing research that we're doing. So as has been said already, the SNA defines exchange values as the values to which goods and services are in fact exchanged or else could be exchanged for cash. That's the important point for the simulated exchange value. And the second point, the simulated exchange value is basically an extension of the proposed in the SEEA paragraph 3.123 of applying prices from similar markets. So it's simply the same idea of applying prices from similar market that the SNA proposes when there is a similar market, is to say, okay, if there is no similar market, let's simulate the similar market. And we are changing, it's the same idea, you bring the prices from outside to a place where there are no prices right now, in the idea of having that could be exchanged at that price. So this is a very simplified version of what Gabriela has presented much better. So I will be very brief and skip to what she has been presented because I like it very much. So basically, you're building a hypothetical market where you're estimating a demand using continuous evaluation, choice experiments, or travel cost method. You get a linear demand or any other form. Then you add some assumptions. In particular, here I'm adding the assumption that the costs are fixed, that there are no marginal costs, adding the assumption of monopolistic competition, as Gabriela mentioned, and then simply maximizing revenue is the same than maximizing profit. So it becomes much easier. You just have to maximize revenue and fix a price. With that, we bring the simulated price to our accounting framework. And as Gabriela also said, once we're doing accounting, we need to deduct man-made inputs. Going back to the question that we had on biodiversity, yes, you can apply that to biodiversity, but you need to find the man-made inputs in protecting biodiversity. That you need to find, but this is not something of the problem of the simulated exchange value. Any accounting effort will need to include deduct man-made inputs to be able to obtain the ecosystem service. Otherwise, we are not finding the net part, which is the ecosystem service, which in this graph is just the rectangular left once you deduct man-made inputs. So it is true, we have a big problem. We are going to discuss it from Spain as well, of finding how much you spend in protecting biodiversity. But we need that if we are going to do economic monetary accounts for biodiversity, independently of the method that we use. It's not something specific about the simulated exchange value. But what has been done in most applications on the supply side? Okay, we find the data, we are able to find a fixed say the cost that we have involved in biodiversity, in recreation, etc. But in general, in the applications that we have done in Spain, we were not able to find a really upward sloping demand supply function. We have to assume that all costs are fixed, basically because we're focusing only on 1 year. If you would do this over several years, then you would be able to estimate a real supply function. But with only 1 year, most applications have been done to 1 year, you end up with a number, how much has been spent on biodiversity or recreation, but you cannot make a supply function. And that's why you introduced the assumption that costs are fixed. But as I said, you always need these costs associated to the ecosystem service that you want to include in your monetary accounts. Demand for applications. Well, Gabriela said before, our paper in 2017 was the first application of the SUV. Unfortunately not, and because it shows how old I already am. It's actually 2003 when we published the first version in environmental resource economics. It was a very basic application, but it already was an application of the simulated exchange value. Then to nature-based recreation. Better application was in 2017. Also this one in Andalusia. The first one was in Madrid, the Sierra de Guadarrama, actually, where those of you who went for a trip on Sunday, the place where we went to the trip is where we did our first application of the simulated exchange value in 2003. Then in choice experiments, we have used, first we did one, UOD et al. 2016, we have a choice experiment applied to recreational service. It's a mistake here. The UOD et al. Applies to recreational service as well, but using the choice experiment. And in Campos et al. 2019 is where we use basically what in the parlance of the SEEA would be ecosystem and species appreciation. But we separated at the time in species maintenance and landscape amenities. Here, as I said before, we built a scenario where we are using a choice experiment, build a scenario where both were supposed to be declining and people had to pay to maintain it. Because as Gabriela already pointed out, you have to value the current situation. So for that, you need to value how much people are paying for the current situation. That's why we made a scenario where it is declining and you're paying for maintaining the current situation. In number of species, we focused only on threatened species, so that you can make it better to understand. We focus only on species that are threatened. And on a handful of landscapes, we focus on a handful of landscapes. What is ongoing in MAIA? Here it's with CSIC. I mean, I'm not right now at the University of Durham, but I was until recently at CSIC, and I'm still on leave at CSIC. But this we are doing it with support from Fernando and Adrian of the University of Rey Juan Carlos. So this is part of MAIA. It's not that we are late. This is additional to what we were supposed to do in MAIA. What we have done in MAIA, we have published about 10 or 12 papers already. So we have done our fair share for MAIA, but since we had additional time, additional resources, we are going beyond. And we are, as we speak almost, we are doing an additional survey where we have done the pre-test, and soon we will have the final version of the test. And here we are applying again the travel cost method to outdoor recreation in national parks, should be said here. And again, the choice experiment to species maintenance and kind of novelty to forest condition. So we're going to make a kind of an accounting of forest condition with our colleagues at the University of Rey Juan Carlos. How has been the applications of the market structure? As we said, Gabriela has explained very well. Monopolistic competition assumes that there's a small number of recreational sites which are quite unique, and you have your site-specific demand function. That's what we did in 2003, what we did in 2016 and 2017 papers. For species maintenance, what we have done is something similar to what Lars did for air pollution in the Netherlands, basically assuming in the parlance of the current SEE that the ecosystem trustee, we were calling it government, but now we would call it ecosystem trustee within the SEEA, acts as a revenue maximizer and sets a fee in return for providing an ecosystem service. And this fee is only paid by those who have a willingness to pay that exceeds that particular fee. So that's how we set it up now to have basically we are simulating a payment for ecosystem service. So in that sense, we have a transaction because Carl said this morning there is no transaction for this species maintenance and landscape amenities or for what is called in the SEEA, as I said before, ecosystem and species appreciation. So we are simulating a transaction, simulating a payment for ecosystem services, basically, that is set up by the government in the form of a fee, but only paid by those who are interested. That's how we did it in 2019, and very similar to what Lars did on his air filtration paper, where he applied the simulated exchange value, also not using the name at the time. So what are we doing right now? So the travel cost method, again, nature-based recreation, monopolistic competition once more, but now with a big difference. We are trying to do it on 10 different national parks, and we are assuming that they can compete among them. So it's not, in the past, we have done perfect competition and monopole, basically. adding some assumptions that ended up being a monopole. Now we are going to let all 10 recreational areas to consider the distance to the other recreational areas when setting a price. So we're kind of making it a bit more complex, the application, but based on a travel cost method this time, because before we used continuing evaluation. And as I said, for the choice experiments, we're repeating basically the species maintenance, improving it, of course, we hope, but especially we are using now forest condition. We are going to put some, so again, the same idea of ecosystem trustee setting a fee, but for improving the forest condition and linking it to the condition accounts that Fernando's team are building for Spain. I think that's going to, in the way forward, it's not part of the current SEEA, but in the way forward, I think it's very interesting to try to link this biophysical ecosystem accounts to these monetary ones that we would like to see as a standard in the future. So how does this work with the travel cost method? Some of you have seen this already. You have a national park in the middle, you have different zones. That's the most basic one. Basically what you're saying, you plot this information and you say, okay, right now people are paying in zone A, which is the closest one. If you go back here, they are paying relatively little. So 15,000 are coming. But I know from information from other areas that some people would have been willing to pay more, willing to pay 10, 9,000 of this is 15. I know that 6,000 would have been willing to pay 15, although they only paid 5, and so on and so forth. And then you construct a demand function. Very simple, has been explained by Gabriela brilliantly, so I'll be very brief. So then you get the consumer surplus and what is already included in GDP, as she mentioned. We carve out part of this consumer surplus, the simulated exchange value. That would be the simplest situation that we have when you apply to only one particular recreational area, which is what we did in the past. We applied it to 10 recreational areas in Andalusia, but each of them was considered as kind of unique. There was no competition between them. So in this graph, we're saying, suppose now to simplify, that they are located in a circle, the recreational areas. So what we did in the past is say that there's one S1, where people are coming from that area. We are doing our monopole and so on. And then there's another one, S3, and they're not really competing. So each one of them can set up the price the way that we did it in Andalusia, the way that also Gabriela just said, because she was, of course, it's absolutely correct, because she was only considering one area. But what we are saying, if there are now 2 areas, they actually can be competing. So in some areas, you need to take into account the price that the other area is setting when setting your own price. That's what we want to take into account, this new version. Here is what you get if you to do the math of what you get. Actually, in the middle column, you said very similar results to the one Gabriela presented, which means probably both of us are doing it right. And because we do it with count models and with discrete choice models for solar economy as well. Anyway, the basic idea here is what you can do, is what we're going to do for Spain. Here's a simple application of an example, not an application, of showing what I'm meaning here. So suppose here, very simple, you have 3 cities, C1, C2, and C3. For some reason, the C1 doesn't show, and 3 recreational areas, site 1, site 2, site 3. And then you have a choice experiment, basically at the home, where you ask people what they're going to do. In this very simple example, I have assumed that they have done 60 interviews in each part, and some people stay at home, some visit S1, S2, S3, and so on. You get this information, just need a little bit more information on the fixed cost, on the travel cost, and on the maintenance cost. You assume you have all that, and then you can already, with this information, you can already obtain your demand function for each of these areas, and you can set the prices that would occur with this data that I'm showing here. In this particular case, the prices would be similar, but that would be the prices that you observe. Okay, so this is just some numbers. It's just to show that there is actually already competition going on. They're not, and each of them is going to set a price taking into account how far away they are from the cities and how much competition they're having. This same idea, we are applying it now in Spain. As I said, we did our pre-test already. We're going to run soon our final test to 10 national parks in Spain. For this place as well, we know already what we have done our 120 pre-test. We're going to now do, in a first round, 1,100 online questionnaires. We may even increase it, obtaining information of visits, where they came from, the cost involved, and the time spent. This is the visitors that we have from previous data, but it's not important. This is historical visits that we have to this area. This is our pre-test. Goes more or less in the same direction, but of course not yet, because we only have 120. But anyway. More importantly, for the questions that come up, we're also doing the same survey. Again, the pre-test has been done for a choice experiment. We're going to do species maintenance maintenance, again, focusing on endangered species and forest condition, with 4 different levels of conditions for coniferous and broadleaf forests. So we have, and focusing in our case on an intervention on 1,000 hectares. So if you go back to the Campos et al. 2019 paper, there was a scenario where we were confronting with a situation where the forest was declining in number, and you have to maintain the current number of hectares. Here we are keeping the same number of hectares, we think is more realistic, and what you're facing is a situation where if you don't intervene, the condition is going to get worse. So we instead of changing the number of hectares as in a previous scenario, 2019, here we're changing the condition. So we're explaining people that in how much forest we have right now of for coniferous and frondosa, as I said, but that's broadleaf. Of coniferous and broadleaves, we are showing some nice pictures, and we're explaining that if we don't intervene, it is not the total number of hectares that will change, it is the condition that will change. I think it's probably more realistic, and that's in any case, we did the other one previously, now we're changing. So again, for species maintenance, we are focusing only on endangered species because we think it's where people have it easier to understand. But here, unfortunately, we don't have yet data, so hopefully we will have some data to show in our last meeting in September. This is the choice experiment that we are doing. It says threatened species, endangered species, broadleaf conifer. Basically, it is the willingness to pay to maintain the current situation. For that, we assume in decreases or increases, but we are always focusing on the current situation. So, summary of what I said very quickly, because we are really under time pressure, my fault. The simulated exchange value is an extension of the approach proposed in the SEEA for prices from similar market. It proposes to simulate the whole market if there are no market where you can go for. The demand is obtained through non-market evaluation methods. Costs involved in providing ecosystem services are needed. And that's something where we also need more collaboration for coming the way forward with the National Statistical Office to get better data on biodiversity maintenance and on recreation in national parks. We really reach out to our national statistical offices because these data, as was said before, are difficult to get. But they're absolutely needed, not only for this method, they will be needed for any monetary ecosystem account. Well, our applications in Spain have shown that it can provide exchange values for a number of things. I would say nature-based recreation is the one that is closer to be, we are closer to have a method that we can tell the NSOs that this is ready to be applied. For ecosystem and species appreciation, as has been said already before, it's probably still in the research domain. We have to work more on it, but I think we can go and have some values also for species maintenance, landscape amenities, condition of forest. And here I would say is where we really need more focus in the research focus in the years to come. So thank you.
Okay, so one very quick question, Adri.
Thanks, Alejandro. I have one kind of funny question and then I guess a real question. The first is, what's your secret to publishing so many papers? And the second is, I was wondering how realistic it is to ask people what kind of forest condition they want. Do they have knowledge of integrity or resilience or those kinds of properties, or you just show them pictures of different ecosystems? I'm not sure how that works. Thanks.
Yeah, well, the first one is a question of being a large team, I guess. It's a relatively large team, and Pablo Campos has been working extremely hard. So that's a little bit the answer. So it's a team effort. For the second one, yes, that's why I'm saying we are still a little bit at the research area for what is not nature-based recreation. I really think people understand perfectly nature-based recreation. There is no problem. You can simulate a market there without any problems. Whether they really understand the condition story is a different story. Of course, Fernando and us, we have had several meetings also with Adrian trying to simplify the message. So we are not going to go, I mean, their condition accounts have like 13 different indicators. It's impossible to explain all these 13 different indicators. So we did not even try. We basically explained a little bit the very basics and let people trust that these are 4 levels of medium, good, very good, bad. So very high level definition of condition. Not going at all into the details because we don't think it can be understood. So as I said, it's a big challenge to make it understandable, but probably if you reduce it to 3 or 4 levels, people are probably able to understand so sorry, I don't have them here, our definitions that we use in our That's a pity, I should have put it. So we make a very simple explanation of what is condition, but it's not the technical explanation, of course, because the technical explanation includes 13, or I don't know how many, Fernando can tell you, different indicators. We are not going that way. We really make it simple so that people can understand it's good, it's bad, it's very bad. Don't know if it answers your question.
Okay, so Adrien, it's your turn.
All right, thank you. Thanks for the organizers. Good afternoon, everyone. So here I'm going to show you what we're doing in France in the MAIA projects on experimenting marine economic accounts. So we're not really looking at valuing ecosystem services or ecosystem assets, but really looking at ecosystem liabilities. And there's a history of doing this kind of work. First developed in the Integrated Environmental Economic Accounting report from 1993. There's been a lot of those kinds of work developed with the Rufi Hueting on sustainable national income and green economy modeling, where he tried to internationalize maintenance and restoration costs into the economy. There's also the Greenstone project. There's in France the work of André Vanoli on unpaid ecological costs. We try to get as close as possible as his definitions to update it in the context of the SEEA EA. And so the conceptual frameworks takes the building blocks of the SEEA EA, but also looks at what kind of accounts and what kind of links there are between accounts to produce these monetary ecosystem liabilities. And so the important thing is that there's the direct link between ecosystem conditions and the monetary values. We don't go through the ecosystem services, but we look at the current ecosystem condition and the reference condition. So that's the really important part. And we then use that to do monetary valuations of required costs. And then from that, we extrapolate on the unpaid ecological costs. And why are we doing this? That's a relevant question. I mean, we're doing this because we feel like there's a policy need. Those kinds of accounts can be directly linked to policy objectives and policy documents in France, in Europe, and elsewhere. We feel that it's also more representative of the pro valuations of ecosystems. So, for instance, in the IPBES debate, there's a lot of these issues of categories of values. And we try to focus on what matters for management directly, looking at 3 dimensions of ecosystem conditions, which are heritage, functionality, and capacity. So those 3 categories of condition are taken from the French ecosystem assessments called EFES, EFESE. And then we tried also to do that for the marine environment. And so we applied this framework to the Marine Strategy Framework Directive, which works into descriptors. There's 9 descriptors, and that fits pretty well with what we want to do. But I guess I won't go too much into details into that. And so then the big issue is what kind of reference levels you can use. So there's a big conversation within the SEEA into what are those reference levels, and they differentiate between natural and anthropogenically dominated systems. And so they try to find pristine conditions for those natural systems. But we think that's not really the good approach. What to us is a better approach is to look at the standards that are defined either from science or from policy documents. So I took this from a paper from Paul Ekins and Arcade Suzubiaga on the science-based targets for reference levels. So for them, there's this typology, where they have environmental limits that are defined really from the science. So you can think of the planetary boundaries. Then there's environmental standards, which are more acceptable functioning level, taking into account society, economy, and internationally negotiated norms. And then there's environmental targets, which are more directly linked to public policies. So you can think about the no net loss of biodiversity or the good ecological status of water or the Water Framework Directive in Europe. But what we think of is not really typology, limits are better than targets, but more the relevance of involving different kinds of communities, because here in this room and online and in the SEEA community, there's a lot of different people coming from different backgrounds. And so potentially this definition of good ecological status are different if you are from those different backgrounds. And so that's what we try to capture with this figure, that reference levels could actually be a mix of those things, and there's a process of defining those things. And so then if you get the reference levels, you can try to use different kinds of methods to estimate the costs of reaching those targets. And so for this applied in the marine environment, we take the typology developed by Harold Levrel, where maintenance costs are divided into the cost of monitoring and information, the cost of preventing environmental degradation, so that's about abatement, I guess, and then the cost of remediation and restoration towards a good ecological status. So there's different kinds of methods to estimate those costs. I don't know if this is really holistic or systematic, but that's kind of what I've understood. And I guess from left to right are these two most costly methods to use. And so in our case, we try to use a bit of those response models, budgeting, and abatement costs. But something that is pretty interesting, in France, we have the ecological accounting chair that tries to link business accounting to national accounting. And there's a conceptual framework called the CARE approach, which tries also to look at the question of ecosystem valuation through liabilities and debts. And so in a perfect world, if the CARE approach is used everywhere and is a standard, then potentially you can just aggregate from all the business accounting on debts to get a national debt. So then we're also thinking about what that means and interpreting the evolution of those costs. So I guess this is a work in progress, but this could be transactions between economic activities and the nature or ecosystem trustees linked to the change in ecosystem condition. But that could also be linked to changes in reference levels, because sometimes those are not really fixed and evolve through times. And also due to the change in the cost of technologies to remediate or restore ecosystems. So it's going to be tricky to interpret those figures. So what we've produced as a case study in France, we looked at the marine environment, and so we report the unpaid ecological cost for the whole economic exclusive zone. So that's the whole colored area. And then we divide it also into marine subregions, which are the reporting units for the Marine Strategy Framework Directive. And so just to show you, I'm going to look at a few examples on 3 descriptors, and each of them are in a different dimension of ecosystem conditions. So you have biodiversity, which is part of the heritage. You have fishing stocks, which are part of the capacity to provide ecosystem services. And then you have eutrophication, which is impacting the functionality of ecosystem condition. And so we use different kinds of methods to try to assess the required costs for these 3 descriptors. For biodiversity, we use budgeting exercises from the French Biodiversity Office that estimates the financial needs to capture what would be good conservation status of the Natura 2000 sites. And this is complemented also by a recent study on the evolution of this network and the costs for different marine habitats. For fishing stocks, we look at the current degradation synthesis from the Marine Strategy Framework Directive evaluation. So that's produced by the Ifremer Research Center. And then we also look at what would be the cost of outing all the trawlers, which are fishing vessels that are the most impactful for the marine ecosystems. And there's a decrease in the French law that allows us to calculate this directly. So we know how much it would cost to buy out the capital of fishing vessels. And then for eutrophication, so we look at the degradation cost synthesis, and then there's going to be further work on abatement costs, but that's outside the scope of what I'm presenting today. So the first approximation is just a dose response model where we look at the current status of good ecological status, and we look at the current cost, and we just extrapolate. Unfortunately, there's not temporal data yet, but there's a revision cycle of the Marine Strategy Framework Directive cost of degradation, and so we'll be able to get more temporal points, and so have a more accurate picture. And so that's what it looks like for eutrophication. So we have only monitoring and prevention costs, because there's no, if you're able to prevent everything, there's going to be natural regeneration, so you don't need to have restoration costs. And so what we can see here is the MC is the Celtic Seas. That's where Brittany is located, and that's where there's a lot of issues because of farming and agricultural practices. And so you see that's the marine subregion where there's the highest costs for eutrophication. So for fishing, there's a lot more. There's a lot of fish stocks that are overfished or that are not in good ecological conditions. So the ratio of debt to current cost is higher, but it's potentially less costly to deal with that issue than to deal with eutrophication. And so that's just, I guess, a recap of everything we've done. And those figures have to be consolidated, so I'm not going to comment them too much. But using the different methods, we have the kind of the same orders of magnitudes of what has to be done in terms of unpaid ecological costs at the French level. And then some perspectives maybe on what that would mean if we integrate these kinds of information into national accounting, and what are the differences between our approach and the approach that is the most advertised in the SEEA. So on the units, they're both potentially in biophysical and in monetary terms. And then on the valuation framing, so the monetary valuation promoted in the SEEA is looking at the impacts on the economy of degradation or improvement of ecosystem services, and so then the stocks is the net present value of the benefits, whereas for our case, we look at the change in ecosystem condition and the maintenance cost to those conditions. In terms of the structure of the institution, there's ecosystem trustees and assets on the balance sheet for the ecosystem service monetary valuations, where we are looking at liabilities, and we feel like there has to be another big system, which is called nature, that those liabilities will be paid to, I guess. And so I guess here the most important thing is that the debts towards nature couldn't really be aggregated into a green GDP. So that's also a difference between what the SEEA wants to do with monetary valuation. So what we try to do here is to have something that is policy relevant and that can inform directly what are the costs to reaching different policy objectives. And so it can contribute to biodiversity resource mobilization efforts. It could also look at residual impacts of different directives, and also potentially budget needs to attain good ecological status, and Green Deal restoration objectives, which are new, but very important. And so, yeah, if we go back to this process, which implies that those accounts are really linking different communities. Here, the implied ecological cost can also inform the setting of targets, so in a retroactive manner, I guess. So that's also something that's interesting. Yeah, I guess in terms of future work, we have to refine those findings, maybe specify more reference levels, because for biodiversity, for instance, it's really hard to find reference levels. And then expand on different dimensions that are not covered so far. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. We made it. Yeah, right on time. I mean, we still have 7 minutes for questions to Adrian or even to the other speakers if you miss the chance to ask them. So we have time to discuss.
Thanks. It's a great presentation, Adrian. Many thanks. It's a really interesting concept, right, and very complementary to other efforts. I have one question that is it, how realistic is it to assume a linear relation between ecological condition and costs of measures? Because even as the curve that was popularized, but not invented, by the way, by McKinsey, of the abatement options shows it's not linear usually, right? Because the cleaner you want to make it, the more expensive it gets. So that is one which seems a strong simplification.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And we use this linear curve just because we don't have any more data. And so this is just the simplest assumption we can make. This is not to be used as the real reality of what's going to happen. But it would be really great to have those different abatement curves for different descriptors. But so far, we don't have that for a lot of those dimensions.
Well, since nobody is saying something to develop such curves, I think, because there is information, right, on technical measures you can take and the cost of these measures, but it's not a simple thing. That is also
and actually it depends on the dimension. So maybe for eutrophication and those technological issues, it's the cost is going up every marginal unit, but maybe for biodiversity, for protected areas, it may be less costly to develop one big marine protected area than a lot of small ones. So then you get into a lot of difficulties on assumptions.
Telling me, can you hear it? Can you hear now, Alessandro? Okay, I'm going to repeat it. Okay, I'm making maybe a silly question. I was saying, sorry for my ignorance about that. But can you compare the level of liabilities, environmental liabilities, with the value of environmental assets and check what is the relationship? Or have you done that for any of the
so we
issues
don't
you
want
have
to do that
mentioned?
because ultimately what we want is to attain good ecological status. So we don't want to make cost-benefit analysis, and that's kind of implicitly what would you do if you compare those two. But I guess maybe that's possible too.
For instance,
Yes.
if you are that is exceed your GDP, or in that case, your liability exceed the estimated value of natural assets, which I think is
and potentially, like, it's just going to be used to say that these are disproportionate costs, and we're just going to not follow what the accounts tell us and do our own thing. But
Hi, Adrian. It's a very interesting presentation, and I think you touched upon some of the ideas I had or issues I found when you come across evaluation of these services. And I think the one aspect, I think the irreversibility is one aspect that it's very difficult to value, and even the cost to recover something that is not recoverable, it's just bogus. And I think even in the climate change literature, there's some discussions on the scientists, where these currents, change, and you basically get to a total different scenario, right? So you can't value that properly, even if you do this cost of maintenance approach. The other idea that came to my mind is the fact that SEEA has provision to account for environmental transactions, right? So you do have some accounting, or at least that should be recorded in the public. I think we discussed this at our lunch about the public environmental expenditures that are currently being undertaken in a country in a given year. So I'm not sure if you're already accounting for that those actions will have some repercussion for the next year's condition of the assets, or whether you're just not taking that into account and you're just thinking of what's happening right now in terms of asset conditions and reference levels, but you're not taking into account what's being spent in the current years.
Yeah, we are.
Okay.
We are looking at what's the current expenditure and then the difference with what should be paid. Yeah. And yeah, for irreversibilities, that's something that is outside the scope of what we can do, and it's potentially an issue. Yeah. I did my PhD on coral reefs, and so there's potentially irreversibilities, and yeah.
I was thinking sometime, like insurance markets don't even capture these properly, but the insurance pricing could be an approach to at least have some some monetary estimations of the, the perceived risk of, an event happening. I think this is kind of from a string events literature. I think that's something has been developed, but probably not to the level of this level of irreversibilities. Yeah.
Joanna raised her hand, so Joanna, you can ask your question.
Yes, thank you very much. I think my question is very much related to the question or to the comment previously mentioned. I would like to ask Adrian if they consider to relate their results to the business sector and how it can be used to assess impacts or dependencies based on their outcomes.
Yeah, so I'm not the best place to talk about business accounting, but yeah, so the goal of the CARE methodology is to propose complete set of debt accounts that can be produced by businesses to look at impacts, and I guess the other side on dependencies, it would be more on the loss of ecosystem services. And there's methodologies to do that with the Anchor database, and now with the standards from the TNFD and the SFDR. There's a lot of work going on into how do we assess impacts and dependencies, and yeah, I guess our work is more focused on the impact part.
Thanks a lot, Adrian.
Okay, thank you very much to all the speakers. We think we can